Story 1. I spent 86 hours playing Dungeons and Dragons for charity. In the last few hours, I was hallucinating so badly that I asked the store owner to call my parents, but no one picked up. I just sat there seeing all sorts of strange things. A friend gave me a ride home, and I slept for 20 hours but felt fine afterward. We raised nearly $5,000 for children's cancer. Story 2. 3 days. During a manic episode, I fell asleep at the wheel and woke up in the wrong lane with oncoming traffic. I jerked the wheel and avoided a head-on collision. Story 3. 3 days ago, I went clubbing. I thought it was Molly, but it couldn't have been. I don't trust anyone now about that. Story 4. 3 to 4 days of sleep deprivation was absolutely torturous. When I had my older son, I was in labor for 18 hours. Then they handed me a baby to take care of and told me to sleep when the baby sleeps, except I couldn't because of everything happening with my body, the machines beeping, and blood pressure checks. I stayed awake too long and learned something about myself. When I get overly tired, falling asleep affects my nervous system. So when I start to fall asleep after being overly tired, my limbs jerk violently, causing me to wake up. It's a vicious cycle. So far, the only way I have learned to combat it is by sleeping on the couch facing the backrest with my arms tucked between me and the backrest. This way, when that reflex happens, it's just a little twitch that I can ignore and continue sleeping, instead of my limbs flailing around and waking me up. By the third day, I would close my eyes and hear voices murmuring in the distance like ambient noise, as if I were in a restaurant, only to realize I was home alone. I would not recommend this experience. Story 5. 3 days. I had gastroesophageal reflux disease, and every time I lay down in any position, it felt like stomach acid was burning a hole in my chest. Story 6. 6 days due to heroin withdrawal. I am uncertain if it counts because microsleeps occur, lasting 15 to 30 minutes. It was an overall terrible experience. Story 7. A little over 3 days. I was 23 when my father died suddenly at 47. I couldn't fall asleep as my mind couldn't process it all. It felt unreal. I remember thinking that if I went to sleep and woke up to find he wasn't there, then it really happened and he was truly gone. It didn't make any sense in hindsight, but grief is strange. I stayed up as long as I could and finally fell asleep 3 days later in the early morning. Story 8. I have a horrible pain problem, and I tried to fix it by using MDMA. Things get weird after day 3. Story 9. About 28 to 29 hours. After the college farewell party, we went to a restaurant by the highway and spent the whole night there, enjoying ourselves. There was good music playing in the cars, and we made the most of the last few days of college. I went home in the morning and then slept. Story 10. I used to work on oil rigs in the Middle East for Schlumberger. These rigs operate around the clock, and when it's time for your job, you start when the rig is ready and go until you're done. This was an exploration rig in the desert of Abu Dhabi in late 1985, and we had many jobs to perform. I was working with a French engineer who was the best I had ever seen. The job lasted over 3 days, and neither of us slept. He chain-smoked gitanes, and we both drank plenty of strong coffee with lots of sugar. Those were fun times. Story 11. For 3 days, we were on a tight deadline and worked 36 hours straight to complete a corporate remodel. We watched people clock in, work a full shift, go home, and return the next day to do it all over again. No drugs were involved for me, just energy drinks, some marijuana, and a bit of punch drunkenness. Story 12. I stayed awake for 38 hours when I was 14 years old. I just wanted to see how long I could go. I'm not sure I want to try this again. Story 13. 36 hours later, I did a parachute jump, full of adrenaline. I celebrated that night into the next day and ended up meeting the person I would marry 20 years later. I slept a lot after that. Story 14. 14 days of meth use took a massive toll on my mental health. I remember hitting the ground because I thought a plane was about to crash into the yard, but it was just a bird. I went to my mother's house, took 3 Xanax bars, and passed out for over 30 hours. After I woke up and saw how bad I looked, I went to rehab. I had gone from 220 pounds to 168 pounds in under 3 months. Story 15, 11 days. The reason was meth. Thankfully, that is not me anymore as I am about to celebrate 7 years free from hard drugs. Nowadays, it's just cannabis and the occasional psychedelic. Story 16, 3 days. I had a panic attack because I learned I can't use stimulants at all for my attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I finally reached my limit and went to the emergency room for help. They gave me a small dose of morphine to relieve the tension in my muscles, and I never took that medication again. Strattera has worked well for my body chemistry. No stimulants for me ever again. Story 17. New Year's 2019. One of my dad's old school friends had just bought a 3-story house and hosted the whole friend group along with their families. Pretty much everyone had kids ranging in age from 9 to 17. We were up at midnight and stayed up past that. The house was in a gated community that was relatively new, so the plots of land around it were mostly empty with very few people around. After telling scary stories and already feeling creeped out, we decided to go outside. There was a house in the middle of construction right across from where we were. No construction workers were there, of course, because it was around 2 a.m. We went in for just a little bit, got spooked, and left. Then we saw someone walking down the street. We were unsure at first, but a bunch of us approached it. Turned out to just be a security guard on patrol, so we wished him a happy new year. We went back in and had some of the New Year's cake before finally going to sleep around 4:30 a.m. Story 18. About 60 hours during the last few days of Hell Week. Then an additional 4 to 5 hours after we returned, because my body was so energized and overtired that I couldn't sleep. Story 19. 5 days, give or take, before it gets strange, you start micro-sleeping here and there for just a few seconds. It was at the Emaboda Festival, the greatest place on earth, filled with copious amounts of hard drugs and potent psychedelics. It was the best time of my life, but I will never do it again. Story 20. I found out my abusive husband was having an affair. I was naive enough to want to fix our marriage, but he ended up leaving my daughter and me for that woman a week later. They are married now. Story 21. Only 2 days. I was at Glastonbury in 2016 when Brexit happened on the first night I was there, so I couldn't sleep while seeing the awful results come in. Story 22. I was forced to go on a business retreat during a depressive episode and was so upset that I didn't sleep for 3 days. 2 of my coworkers, who were a married couple, instructed me to leave my car in the parking lot, lie down in the back seat of their sport utility vehicle, and go to sleep. I was so exhausted that I did exactly that. Story 23. About 2.5 days, surprisingly not drug-related. Sometimes I just don't get tired, and if I keep myself busy with movies, books, or work, I can stay awake. At least once a month, I will stay awake for 24 to 36 hours straight with no issues. I regularly take over-the-counter sleep aids to help establish a more regular sleep schedule. Otherwise, I would probably only get about 12 to 15 hours of sleep a week. Story 24. Not as long as some comments here, but around 30 hours. I had food poisoning and was taking 3 flights to return from my vacation to my home city. Story 25. A month on drugs because money was flowing well. A week without drugs. I can either sleep all day or not sleep at all. My body is strange. Story 26. Memory is blurry, but I think I struggled to move on for 1 day. It's crazy how people here are talking about it for more than 2 days. Story 27. 30 hours roughly. It was due to coming from the opposite side of the world and having school immediately afterward. Honestly, it wasn't even that bad, and I had no caffeine or any stimulants. Story 28. 3.5 days were spent waiting to farm for the shiny metallic robe in Lower Guck. It was a rare drop from a rare spawn. During this time, only 2 dropped, and a Death Knight won the role for 1. The other went to an enchanter. Story 29. About 40 hours, it was a test for a new antidepressant that just kept me awake and clear. I was not tired. I crashed hard afterward and slept well for about 12 hours. It did not make it to the markets. Story 30. 2.5 days ago, I saw an alien in my REM sleep and started researching, only to realize it was real. I entered another dimension through my consciousness. Changed my life. Story 31. A few times I dedicated 72 hours. My favorite was using a long weekend for photography. I took pictures each day and spent each night in the darkroom. Story 32. I spent around 74 hours awake during the summer when I was 16. I was struggling mentally and refused to let myself sleep, but I can't remember why. Story 33. I think I made it 4 days. We went home after our first semester of college. This was 2003, so we didn't have smartphones, but we were texting all the time. A group of us decided to have a wake-a-thon for no real reason other than being bored. Of course, it was an honor system. If you don't answer a text within 15 minutes, you're declared out. But I finished a 1,000-piece puzzle and started hallucinating by the end. I really miss being 19. Story 34. 5 days of hyperadrenergic postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome and chronic pain occur occasionally. The highest doses of Ambien or Lunesta or anything else had minimal effect, similar to that of an aspirin. I have developed a protocol for managing short episodes, but when it occurs, no one in my life can tell. I act completely normal and feel great until I crash. Story 35. About 98 hours, just over 4 full days. It's a high school tradition to stay awake as long as possible at band camp. It was miserable. I would have sacrificed anything for an hour of sleep. Try it, and you'll see why sleep deprivation is considered torture. It becomes unbearably awful after around 80 hours. Story 36. I experienced trauma-induced insomnia for about 6 days, during which I went through cycles of being unable to sleep for 3 to 6 days, followed by periods of sleeping for 2 to 6 hours when my body could no longer cope. This cycle continued for a month or two, but my memory of that time is unclear due to the trauma and lack of sleep. Eventually, I became ill and took some nighttime medication, which allowed me to achieve dreamless sleep for about 12 hours at a time. Story 37. 5 nights. Meth use led to many hallucinations, both auditory and visual, by the 3rd night. Delusional paranoia intensified by the 4th night. Story 38. I worked a night shift at the time, and we were about to move out of an apartment into a house I had bought. Everyone else was at home the entire day. I got home at 6 a.m. after a 12-hour shift and found that nothing was prepared except what I had packed myself. The people helping us move were set to arrive at 7:30. I was frustrated that nothing was ready. We had to get moving and managed to pack everything and move the entire house in one day. Once everything was moved, one of our roommates invited about 10 people to the new house that same day for a party that I knew nothing about. I was again frustrated, but the party continued. A group of drunk people created tracks in our yard because they couldn't figure out how to park. Eventually, people left around 5 or 6 a.m. I hadn't unpacked anything and distinctly remember nailing a blanket over my bedroom window with a shoe so I could go to bed without the sun disrupting my sleep later that day. Story 39. Around 30 hours. Not sure anymore. First day of the first LAN party. StarCraft, Battlefield 1942, Quake 3, Diablo 2, Typing of the Dead. Absolutely amazing. Story 40. 3 days. My job is terrible. I endured almost a year of being awake for 2 to 3 days regularly. I can tell it has permanently damaged me. Story 41. It was quite difficult. I spent 48 hours intermittently talking to a man who was manipulating me when I was 15 and he was 24. The impact likely led my mom to believe I was drinking or using drugs, as I exhibited slurred speech and said nonsensical things. Strange times. Story 42. Around 4 days of bipolar experience left me uncertain whether I was facing sleep-deprived delusions, mania, or both. I can say now that, as someone who has loved sleep since childhood but either sleeps too much or not enough, I have learned to find solace and guilt-free acceptance in those deep nights when the world is asleep. I acknowledge that I will be tired the next day, and that is okay. 15 years later, I notice the fear and unease that those quiet hours evoke in some people who do not struggle with sleep. I want to emphasize to anyone who may be up for days due to mental health issues, stress, anxiety, or substance use to forgive yourself when you need to rest afterward. Those quiet hours can be intimidating at first, but embrace the tranquility that comes when others are asleep. You gain a peace that doesn't exist during the day. This is where you are, and it won't change with guilt or pressure. Explore what can be special and calming for you in the world. Sleep will always come. Story 43, 3.5 to 4 days. I experienced significant pain from what was ultimately diagnosed as an ovarian cyst measuring over 10 inches. Even in the hospital with Dilaudid, the medication was only sufficient to allow me to lie down fully, but it did not enable me to sleep. After the surgery, I felt as though I had been unconscious for a week. Story 44. 3 days of fun in high school because we heard you hallucinate. I didn't hallucinate, but I had a very realistic dream on the way home. I was in the back of my parents' car, headed home, and suddenly I was playing basketball. I literally tried to jump to block a shot, and my head, arm, and hands hit the roof of the car, waking me up. Story 45. I used to play poker all weekend at an Indian casino back in the 1990s. They closed at 2 a.m. during the week, but were open 24 hours on Friday and Saturday. From Friday at 8 p.m. until Monday at 2 a.m., Sunday night, I would be awake. I didn't do this every weekend, but I did it more than a few times. I averaged about 60 hours a week total, but it was the weekends where the opportunities were more prominent. During the week, there were many regulars, and they tended to be tougher to get money from. No drugs or anything. I enjoyed the game and was a pretty good player. For a couple of years, I made a living doing that. I didn't get rich like some of the people you see on television. It equated to about a $6 per hour job, which back then was enough to pay bills. I loved every minute of it. Story 46. 2 days later, I took some final exams and then drove to Colorado. I got stuck in a traffic jam and ended up falling asleep. Story 47. 72 hours of work. No drugs. I went to work Thursday morning and worked late. A friend called to ask if we should find a bar. In the morning, I thought I would just go back to work. I continued this until Sunday morning when I started seeing things that didn't exist. Story 48. After 48 hours, I became psychotic and believed that if I slept, the world would reset, and I would be in a different timeline on a new earth as a different person. Story 49. 3 days, 24-hour fasting event raising awareness about children starving in Africa. I had already been up for a long day when it started. It was a church event, and the only thing we were allowed to consume was water. We convinced ourselves to stay up all night, so none of us got any sleep. When the 24 hours were up, I was picked up by my parents and driven 4 hours to a hockey tournament my father was participating in. I have no interest in hockey, so I stayed in our hotel room and watched movies such as Santa Claus vs. The Martians and Victor/Victoria. I was approaching 36 hours without sleep and felt so out of it that my ears and eyes seemed disconnected from my brain. I could almost predict the next line of the movie before it was spoken. No awareness was raised. Story 50. For 3 days, repeated over the course of 5 months, I was experiencing liver failure. This condition disrupted my circadian rhythm. I felt extremely tired, itchy, sick, and in pain, and even sleep seemed to evade me. Story 51. When I was finishing my master's thesis, I was writing and editing the final draft for 42 hours straight. No drugs, but I drank a lot of yerba mate and have never been able to have any since. It worked out though. The head of the program complimented me on it, and it was picked up by a local city government. Story 52. I had about 3 hours of sleep, but my normal limit is 16 hours. To keep it brief, I had a flight to catch at midnight. I intended to sleep during the drive, but I couldn't. I planned to sleep on the plane as well, but that didn't happen. After landing in the morning, I realized that sleeping in the hotel would disrupt my sleep schedule. So, I fought to stay awake since I was finally tired enough to sleep. Story 53. Around 40 hours waiting for my final render of a computer animation to finish on a PC with 64 megabytes of RAM. This was in 1995, and it was considered high-end at that time. If the render bar stopped, I would have to redo it, so I needed to keep an eye on it. To stay awake, a barista suggested drinking soda and eating chocolate-covered espresso beans. I began to hallucinate that my furniture was moving and skewing in perspective. It was an interesting experience. Story 54. 8 days of heavy drug use involved research chemicals called APVP and MDPV. Amphetamine felt like taking a sleeping pill compared to those substances. The drugs were intensely harmful. I used intravenous methods at the time, which damaged the veins where I injected them. In the end, I experienced severe hallucinations. For example, every cloud appeared as though it was an elephant. Along with that, I dealt with paranoia and extreme fatigue, yet I could not sleep no matter what. I concocted a cocktail that could have put anyone to sleep, consisting of oxycodone, opioid, midazolam, very strong benzodiazepine, and tizanidine, muscle relaxant. It is truly miraculous that I did not die from drug use because mixing various dangerous drugs like opioids and benzodiazepines was not uncommon for me. Story 55. I spent around 52 hours doing my first game jam and thought I would stay up for the entire duration, which was about 3 or 4 days. Eventually, I just couldn't think clearly and decided to take a quick nap for about 2 or 3 hours. When I woke up, it felt like I was reborn. Story 56. A little over 2 days. I had no reason. I just didn't like sleeping. I was in college at the time. I couldn't do it now. I had so much caffeine that I thought I was going to have a heart attack. Story 57. It depends on how you define sleep. I had a bout of insomnia that lasted for more than 3 weeks, but I can't say I didn't sleep at all. I probably slept a good 3 or 4 hours in 10-minute increments. It was one of the worst physical experiences I've ever had, which includes cutting off a finger, crashing a motorcycle into a chain link fence at 50 miles per hour, getting mumps, and experiencing pancreatitis. Given a choice to avoid one of those things, I think I would choose pancreatitis first and insomnia second. It was brutal. Felt like I was being tested by the entire universe. The feeling of being so tired that you can't sleep is overwhelming. Story 58. I worked as a backstage caterer for about 10 years, totaling around 55 hours. Between build day and the first 2 show days, one day blended into the next. By the end, I was borderline delusional and hallucinating. The headliner was Paul McCartney, and by the time we had him off stage and back onto his bus, the crew for the next day's headliner, Kings of Leon, was arriving and requesting breakfast. It was brutal. Story 59. I spent 40 hours on a bus trip with a group. Due to my height, I couldn't find a comfortable sleeping position, which prevented me from sleeping. Some people slept twice and were shocked to see that I was still awake. It was awful wanting to sleep but being unable to do so. Story 60. I was in the hospital after undergoing a 9-hour surgery. I was under anesthesia for a total of 20 hours and then did not sleep for the next 5 days. It was the worst experience of my life. Story 61. A little over 80 hours. I had an infection in my jawbone that made the bottom left side of my mouth feel like every tooth needed a root canal. I am not joking when I say I have been shot and stabbed, and both of those experiences were nowhere near as painful as this infection. By the 3rd day, it felt like my body was falling apart, as if my bones would fall right out of their joints. A friend of mine brought me some nerve pain medication and Vicodin, and I was able to sleep. I tell her often that I think she saved my life. Story 62. 6 days of insomnia. I took something that was supposed to help me sleep, but it didn't work as expected. Story 63. Probably 3 or 4 days. I experienced a severe insomnia episode about a decade ago. I just couldn't sleep. Story 64. 3 days of running away from a criminal cult led to finding a shed, where I stayed for another 3 days, sleeping inside. Story 65. I had my first night shift at a nursing home when I was 20 years old. I drank 6 cups of strong black coffee to stay awake and ended up awake for the next 3 days. Story 66. I ran a 250-kilometer race that started in the middle of the night, with no sleep leading up to it from the day before. The race took a little over 36 hours of running time, plus time for recovery and waiting for friends to finish, with a cutoff of 48 hours. After that, I traveled back home. In addition to that, I often stay awake for 3 consecutive days when I visit my children. I spend the entire day awake and then take a late flight that lasts 24 to 30 hours. Unfortunately, I cannot sleep on flights, so I remain awake for that duration as well. I land early in the morning and must stay awake all day upon arrival. Story 67, 56 hours in graduate school. I was purifying protein through multiple steps. It was unusual to go to work, be there all day, see everyone leave, stay overnight, see people return, and then do it again. In the end, the preparation went into the freezer, and no one cared, so let this be a lesson to everyone. Story 68. 5 days due to a psychosis. The fourth and fifth days were intense. On the fourth day, my father-in-law asked me to make him a cigarette, and I ended up making around 60 or 70. On the fifth day, I was thirsty, so I went to a grocery store. I stood in the soup section for about 10 minutes, wondering why they didn't have soda. My thought was that since soup is made of water, they must have drinks there as well. Insomnia is no joke. The longer you stay awake without sleep, the more your brain suffers. Throughout the day, brain cells are dying, and new cells can only be created during sleep. Story 69. I don't know how often I microslept, but it was about 7 days on medication. I started seeing strange things by day 3, and on the last day, I was barely connected to reality and likely on the brink of full-blown psychosis. Story 70. 4 days with the new ADHD medication kept me awake while feeling perfectly fine. On day 4, I banged my head twice as I fell asleep standing in the kitchen. I sat down to watch a movie and woke up 26 hours later. Story 71. I went a week with little or no sleep. I was a raving lunatic on the last day. The thought of another sleepless night led to a crying meltdown, which surprisingly relaxed me enough to finally sleep. I have chronic pain in my back, and that keeps me awake. Story 72. 30 hours later, my boyfriend was in the hospital following a freak incident. I went home at 3 a.m. to cry in bed and returned to his room at 10 a.m. Story 73. Last year, I was in inpatient psychiatric treatment. Due to my severe social anxiety and other circumstances, the therapists and doctors decided that a single room would work better for me, as normally 2 patients shared a room. For weeks went by and it was not great. I got sick, had to quarantine, and did not connect with my therapist, but I got along well with my fellow patients, and the group therapy felt helpful, so I stayed. After 4 weeks, my therapist interrupted me mid-session while I was sharing a traumatic memory to tell me that by 8 a.m. the next day, I needed to get out of my room and move into a room with someone else. He could not even tell me who the new roommate would be and then ended the session 20 minutes early. This sent me into a spiral. I packed all my belongings by 8 a.m. and had to store them in someone's office until noon when they finally had the other room ready. By then, I found out that my new roommate was not from my group of fellow patients but a stranger from a neighboring ward who could not deal with her snoring roommate anymore. Fun fact: my excessive snoring was one reason I had a single room in the first place. At that point, I could not sleep anymore. I was in a constant state of panic, spiraling hard, and even reached out to the night nurses, but they did not seem to care. On the third night, one nurse became annoyed that I kept wandering the halls to use the restroom. We had one in our room, but I did not want to wake my roommate with the loud flushing sound. She asked me why I was not sleeping. I explained that I was struggling with the change and had not slept since then. She decided the best course of action would be a homeopathic sleep aid, which was essentially a sugar pill, but she had to call the on-call doctor for approval. To this day, this part is the funniest part of this story. She called the doctor, explained what she wanted to give me, and the doctor started laughing, saying something along the lines of, "This patient hasn't slept in 3 nights. No sleep aid has worked, and you want to give her essentially sugar?" Then, the doctor prescribed a low dose of a heavy sleeping pill I was already familiar with. However, since I was in such a deep spiral and was not doing well, I could not bring myself to take the pill because I was scared of losing control. The very kind nurse literally forced me to take the pill, and it was the worst sleep I ever had. I quit the treatment a day later and instead participated in a daily outpatient program for a couple of months, which worked better for me. Story 74. I stay up more than I sleep. I can easily go 4 to 5 days without feeling any different. Occasionally it's longer, but I don't really keep track. I have become accustomed to this sleeping habit. I do a lot of nodding during these periods. I'm not talking about short naps or naps at all. Just closing my eyes for 15 to 20 minutes here and there while I'm busy. For some reason, that allows me to stay awake for days on end. If I start to feel strange or if people mention that I'm acting oddly, then I definitely go to sleep. But I don't seem to be affected by it at all. Only once, after being awake for 8 days straight, did I begin to feel delirious, as if I might start losing my mind. So I decided to go to sleep. And yes, substances are very much involved. They have been for over a decade. I'm not proud of it, but it's relevant to the story. I know it's not healthy, but I must admit that I appreciate having 12 extra hours in my day to be productive. Sleeping just seems like such a waste of time that could be used for getting things done. Story 75. 40 hours without drugs and a bit of insomnia. Before my days off, after work and on off days, I make my espresso, which is equivalent to 6 cups. After coming home from work and while cooking, I felt my adrenaline kick in and ignored my instinct. I still made the espresso, creating a roller coaster of insomnia. Story 76. 3 days after graduating high school, I started experiencing overwhelming emotions and didn't fall asleep until I had sobbed violently for half an hour because the project I was working on wasn't coming together. I felt like a failure and believed I wouldn't amount to anything. After that, I slept for 26 hours, only getting up for the bathroom and to cry. My therapist mentioned that I need to be evaluated for bipolar disorder, which frightened me, and I have been avoiding the topic ever since. 6 years later, I still haven't been evaluated for it, so I'm still unmedicated, but I have been working on coping skills, which helps a bit. Story 77. At minimum, 2 days. I lost track of the actual time I stayed up. I saw a video from Life Noggin about Randy Gardner, who spent 11 days without sleep for an experiment. In case you were curious, he was not the same afterward. I wanted to see if I could beat him. It was foolish, I know. I was 10 and did things out of spite back then. It was going well, albeit a bit disorienting. Being in a dimly lit room while lying in bed made it too comfortable to accidentally fall asleep. Story 78. I was about to go to sleep at 1 a.m. when my wife went into labor, so we went to the hospital. I was in the delivery room with her, holding her legs while she pushed until around noon the next day. Overall, it was somewhere around 36 hours. Story 79. We had a 2.5-day trip with school. We wanted to enjoy most of the trip. During the day, we explored the town, and at night, we talked and socialized. Story 83 days of local law enforcement and Federal Bureau of Investigation Joint Task Force operation. I cannot share specific details, but it was an intense experience. I will never forget that time. Story 81. 5 days of difficulty. I was prescribed Ativan for anxiety and was instructed by my doctor to stop taking it suddenly. This led to 5 days of sleeplessness, or perhaps I experienced microsleeps. I recall pacing in front of my bed without any memory of doing so. I last remembered being in the kitchen. The following morning, I found myself driving with no recollection of grabbing my keys or leaving the house, let alone entering my car. It turns out that you need to gradually reduce your dosage of Ativan rather than stopping abruptly. I had to temporarily return to the medication to properly wean myself off it. Frustrating doctor. Story 82. 42 hours. First combat deployment in the Israel Defense Forces in 2003. Being in a first cycle in a veteran company was challenging back then, but now it is supposed to be much easier. Story 83. I was hospitalized for extreme insomnia following the death of my husband at the start of 2017. I had gone 3 weeks prior to going into the hospital, getting maybe 20 minutes of sleep a day in total. They put me on numerous medications and kept me for another 3 weeks. When the right combination allowed me to get a total of 4 hours of sleep in a 24-hour period, they discharged me. Anytime my insomnia lasts more than 3 days without sleep, I become terrified of experiencing another episode. In the summer of 2019, I had another 3-week bout. I was nearly driven to desperation for sleep, which was terrifying. I couldn't function. I was walking into walls and hallucinating. That hospitalization lasted 2 weeks, and again I was discharged after I managed to get a total of 4 hours of sleep in 24 hours. Story 84. About 48 hours, give or take. The Wrath of the Lich King came out, and I wanted to reach the rating level quickly. Story 85. 3 days for me. Shockingly not because of drugs but stress. I was living with a toxic ex-friend who put me through so much emotional and financial stress that for the first time in my life I had no appetite. As someone with a binge eating disorder and constant food-related thoughts, this was something I had never experienced before. I was having the most terrifying nightmares, and it got to the point where I was afraid to go to sleep. So I fought sleep for as long as I could. Eventually, my right eye started twitching uncontrollably, and it really felt as if I wasn't in my body. I truly underestimated what stress can do to your body and mind. I apologize for the length of this message. Story 86. 3.5 days. I did not feel exhausted or tired. I went camping and stayed up the entire weekend as well as the day before. I smoked a lot of cannabis. Story 87. 50 hours and working. I have a job with the most difficult manager. I suggested we work 12-hour shifts split between day and night, but he insisted that we all stay until the job is done. It became a competition of who could endure longer. The job ran significantly over time because everyone felt they had done enough and should have left earlier. I warned him that people would get hurt, and they did. I refused to deal with that again. South Africa's De Beers Diamond Company. Story 88. Not me. My friend was on drugs for 11 days. He was not himself before he went to sleep. I don't know how his body and mind survive such long trips, but after many experiences of this kind, he is still doing fine mentally, at least. Story 89. 4 days. I was bored in high school and wanted to see what would happen. The funny thing was I hit a wall around day 3 and no longer needed sleep. Story 90. I remember being overwhelmed at 16 years old. I got home at 11 p.m. after a day session and set a timer for 6 a.m. to start work at the cooperative the next day. I was transfixed by the timer and felt as though hours passed in minutes. The come down hit an hour or so into the shift. I have not touched narcotics since. Story 91. 48 hours when I was a teenager. I consumed about 10 or 11 cans of energy drink. I don't know why I did it, but I ended up hallucinating a woman crawling out of the wall to grab me. It was scary, so I never did that again. Story 92. 4 days awake and suffering from insomnia. Hydroxyzine did not help. I started seeing ghosts and hearing my name called very calmly, which was quite unnerving. Story 93. 3 days. Medically supervised and sober during a study on the health effects of sleep deprivation. It gets much weirder than you think, and you will fall asleep. We were essentially followed around by people prompting us to stay awake in shifts. I would absolutely never do this again. Story 94. I worked for 36 hours with back-to-back evening and morning shifts that were both very long. I was barely functional by the end of it. Story 95. Very recently, during Easter, I developed acute sinusitis, which resulted in a fever that prevented me from sleeping at all for a week. During the week before Easter, I had less than 5 hours of sleep. By the 5th day, I had to go to the hospital for treatment as my mind was unraveling. I was so overwhelmed that I couldn't visualize anything. If you said blue car, my mind generated absolute nonsense, and I couldn't picture what I was told. It was terrifying. Thankfully, antibiotics resolved the issue quickly, but it was the scariest experience I've had in a long time. Story 96. I know someone who said he went 62 days without sleeping. I don't know if that's possible. He was in the military and might have had a substance abuse problem. He didn't go into detail, and I don't know why he brought it up. Story 97. I completed a 30-hour bike race and finished in 5th place. I wasn't expecting to rank high, so I rode my fat bike instead of my road bike. I covered a distance of 225 miles, and my team, which consisted of just me, was named Thick in the Rear, Thicker in the Front. Story 98. 3 days with an 18-month-old who was too excited to sleep was challenging. It was difficult to stay awake. We had flown from Germany to the United States, and the trip seemed to overwhelm him. Story 99. 56 hours. From waking up on the morning of the event to passing out on a sofa long after I finished the Lakeland 100 Ultra Marathon, which is approximately 105 miles. The second night was tough. It was pitch black up high on a trail with no real signs of human life anywhere. My head torch reflected back in my face from the fog and low cloud, and I kept thinking my own footsteps were coming from something else behind me. Even when I figured out it was just my own footsteps, I would still forget and keep looking around. It's all a mental game. Your body can do amazing things, but you have to tell yourself you can do it over and over again. There are many mental strategies to help you figure your way through to the end. Story 100. I spent about 40 hours on a single road trip after working an excessive number of hours. It was unwise. I relied on energy drinks and nicotine. Story 101. 4.5 days without sleep, food, or proper hydration. I was unwell and spent the entire time lying in bed. I couldn't move my head as I felt like I was losing consciousness. I was sick for the whole week and felt more pain than usual. My mental state was at an all-time low. At 1 a.m. on Monday, I went to the hospital. The substance involved was 2CB, 25 milligrams. I will never forget this experience, as it includes both good and bad memories. Story 102. 3 days. I have never been able to sleep on an airplane, regardless of the time or duration. We returned to Scotland several years ago, and I decided not to go to bed the night before our flight. I stayed up all night, went to work, came home early, cut the grass, and then went to the airport to catch our evening flight across the ocean. I never even dozed off during the 7-hour flight. We landed, got our rental car, and drove about 3 hours to a castle we hadn't seen before. After looking around, we had lunch and then began our 4-hour drive into the Highlands. Looking back, it really wasn't a good idea to be driving. We had dinner reservations for 7 p.m., and I was struggling to stay awake. When we arrived at our accommodation for the night, I showered, and then I fell asleep for 15 hours. It was glorious. I woke up a new man, and I still remember that as the best night of sleep I have ever had. To add, I do not drink coffee, tea, or soft drinks, so I was staying awake on sugar and pure will. Story 103. Editing a radio interview started on Friday afternoon and finished on Monday morning, just in time to sleep through my first class. Story 104. I spent 42 hours during my last year of college working on my thesis. I procrastinated and left it until the last few weeks. In the final 2 days before the deadline, I stayed awake on sheer willpower and coffee. By the end, I was shaking and passed out in my car in the college parking lot after submitting it. I woke up 6 hours later still there. Story 105. About 36 hours, my second child was 2 months old and breastfeeding every 3 hours. My husband was sick, and my oldest child had to go to school, so I needed to get him ready every day due to his physical disabilities. Story 106. 5 days after the death or disappearance at sea of a very close loved one, we were halfway around the world from our family. Story 107. I worked a 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. shift on a Friday in the operating room as a surgical technologist. My on-call period started at 3 p.m. and ended Monday morning at 7 a.m. I worked 23 hours with a half-hour break. The last case involved distracting a femur while the surgeon was reaming and placing the nail. I was 7 to 8 months pregnant and wearing a lead apron. Story 108. 6 days as a teenager, no drugs. I just wanted to see how long I could last. First day, tired but manageable. Second day, really tired, impacting my thinking. Third day, exhausted, struggling to think. Fourth day, could fall asleep at any moment, zoning out of reality. Fifth day, can't even sit down for 1 minute without microsleeping. Can't understand words, concepts, or grasp what's happening on TV. So tired I could literally collapse. Sixth day, hyperactive and alert, hearing voices, feeling overwhelmed, not tired at all, full of energy, can think clearly and understand everything, but definitely feeling off. I slept for over 24 hours. I never told my family I was doing this, so I was surprised they didn't think I was in a coma. It really disrupted my sense of days. No matter how many times someone told me what day it was, it didn't register or make sense. I'm completely back to normal now. If I still had my old notes, I could have copied them here, but this was nearly 15 years ago, so memory will have to suffice. Story 109. Friday morning to Monday evening was very exhausting. By Monday evening, I actually struggled to fall asleep. It felt like I had forgotten how to do so. Story 110. 72 hours just to see what it was like. I started hallucinating colored shapes where people were at the end. Story 111. When I was about 8 years old, I still remember staying awake the entire night because I saw a lot of scary content from Gacha Life, which I really dislike. No offense to the people who enjoy it, but I just can't appreciate it because it brings back many bad memories from my past. Story 112. 2 nights. My psychiatrist tried to wean me off my nighttime Ativan, but it caused me insomnia. I was in tears the second morning because I couldn't sleep. Story 113. Almost 30 hours of driving my semi-truck nonstop from Miami back home, and after that, I quit professional driving forever. I am much happier as a mechanic now. Some days I am up all night, but I get to go home and sleep in my bed every day. Story 114. I slept for 16 hours and wasn't just sleepy afterward. So I played video games, watched movies, and cleaned the house. Soon I realized it had been 24 hours, but I didn't want to go to sleep in the middle of the day, so I stayed awake until night. Story 115. With the exception of 2 2-hour naps over 5 days, I worked on midterm papers while being employed. If I had no naps, I had 0 sleep during the first 3.5 days. Story 116. Almost 4 days of travel, an evening flight to the east, and an inability to sleep on planes caused me to miss the first night's sleep. Meeting up with friends and attending a rave made me miss the second night's sleep. A family friend picked me up early in the morning and drove me to my parents' house. I had dinner and then worked all night. I went home, took a shower, and slept until it was time for the next shift. I miss being 22. Story 117. I probably spent about 3 days feeling unwell after taking an overdose of caffeine during a suicide attempt. During those 3 days, I don't remember sleeping at all. I just lay on the bed, feeling nauseous and occasionally throwing up. Story 118. 70 hours. I made a deal with my high school crush that we would chat and listen to music through the night. We did. I feel old. Story 119. The first 3 nights after my husband left, I just didn't know where to put myself. I don't think I'm alone in feeling this way. Story 120. I used to be a chef and had a teething baby. I worked a 14-hour shift while taking care of the crying baby while my wife took a nap. When she got up, I took a shower and returned to work for a 12-hour shift. It may not seem particularly long in the grand scheme of things, but I was exhausted by the end of it. Story 121. 3 days. I went on a solo landscape photography trip to the Shetland Islands from Manchester, UK. I attempted to sleep in the car for the duration of my trip and didn't sleep at all for the first few days due to traveling, the sticky 28 degrees Celsius temperature, and high summer, which meant it never went dark at that latitude. Additionally, my car was much more uncomfortable to sleep in than I remembered. Eventually, I found a lovely Airbnb and slept soundly. I highly recommend Shetland. It's a beautiful place. Story 122. I have severe chronic insomnia and once stayed awake for 5 days straight. It was horrendous. Thank goodness for cannabis. Story 123. It looks like either drugs or babies will do the job, judging by this thread. Mine was the baby's one. I had nearly a week with only a few brief micro-sleeps. I was unwell and had to stay in the hospital after giving birth. It was the most stressful week of my life. Story 124. 60 hours of college finals in architecture. The first night was fine, the usual stress during finals season. The second night was rough. Everything felt painful. I slept the next day after dropping my scale model and presentation materials. I went to a classmate's apartment near the campus to rest. I informed the professor that I would not be returning for the scale model or the presentation panels. I assume I didn't look well, as he replied, "Sure, no problem," when typically, students are expected to return and collect their work. Story 125. 48 hours, young and free, and it didn't matter. It was fun, and those were the days of zero responsibility. Story 126. Around 50 hours. I woke up in Los Angeles and had a flight back to London. I drove home to Cornwall and went to a friend's birthday party. Story 127. I worked for about 40 hours without any drugs. I was on the night shift and had to attend a funeral during the day, which caused me to miss my sleep opportunity before going back to work. Story 128. I was awake for 120 hours while my mom was sick and almost dying. I started to hallucinate and thought people were trying to kill me. I saw family members' faces in passing cars. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital because of it. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.